Welcome to TKX Stories, where the strange and the mysterious come to life. Tonight, we bring you one of H.P. Lovecraft's most haunting tales. The music of Erich Zann. Imagine a melody so strange, so eerie, it defies explanation. A song that calls to forces beyond our world, played by a man whose music may be the only thing standing between our reality and the unknown. In this tale, a young man is drawn to the unsettling music of an old violinist, only to discover that what lies beyond the notes is something far darker than he could ever imagine. Stay with us as we unravel the chilling mystery behind Erich Zann's cursed violin and find out what happens when the music stops. It was in the labyrinthine streets of an ancient, decaying city that I first wandered beyond the familiar. I had spent days exploring its forgotten alleys, the remnants of some bygone era clinging to the architecture like ghosts. The buildings grew older as I ventured deeper, their towering facades casting long shadows that seemed to stretch further than the daylight allowed. Eventually, I stumbled upon Rue d'Ossel, a steep, narrow street hidden away from the bustling parts of the city. It felt like a place that time had abandoned. The air was heavier here, the silence unnatural, and the street seemed to bend and twist in ways that defied logic. It was as though Rue d'Ossel existed in a different world, separate from the one I had known. The description of the city in Rue d'Ossel hints at Lovecraft's fascination with forgotten places, where time and reality blur. This first glimpse of Rue d'Ossel establishes it as a liminal space, something not quite within the normal bounds of reality. The eerie silence and unnatural layout of the street foreshadow the unsettling forces at work, preparing the listener for the gradual descent into the unknown. As I ascended Rue d'Ossel, the climb grew steeper, and the buildings leaned toward each other in a claustrophobic embrace. Each step felt like I was walking deeper into a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The windows of the houses were dark, many of them boarded up, as though their inhabitants had long since abandoned them, yet the street was not entirely empty. Now and then, I caught glimpses of figures lurking in doorways or peering out from behind heavy curtains. They were shadowy, indistinct, and always seemed to vanish as soon as I turned my head. The further I climbed, the more disconnected I felt from the world I had left behind. This scene heightens the sense of isolation and otherworldliness. The narrator's journey upward symbolizes a transition into a place outside of normal human experience. The shadowy figures evoke Lovecraft's theme of the unknown, lurking presences that exist just out of sight, suggesting that Rue d'Ossel harbors more than meets the eye. The narrator's growing disconnection mirrors the feeling of entering a realm of mystery and horror, where logic and reason begin to unravel. At the top of Rue d'Ossel, I found a tall, decrepit building that seemed as though it had grown out of the street itself, its dark stone walls cracked and worn by centuries. A small, faded sign in the window advertised rooms for rent. Compelled by a strange curiosity, I knocked on the heavy wooden door. An old woman answered, her face wrinkled and expressionless, her eyes dull as though drained of life. Without a word, she led me through narrow, winding corridors that seemed to shift and change as we walked. Finally, we arrived at a small, dimly lit room on the top floor, furnished with only the barest essentials. The air was cold, the walls damp, but I felt a strange comfort in its isolation. This scene introduces the narrator's temporary home and further deepens the atmosphere of decay and neglect. The building's shifting corridors and the cold, damp room add to the unsettling feeling that nothing in Rue d'Ossel follows the normal rules of reality. The landlady's lifeless demeanor hints at the idea that this place has drained the vitality of those who live there, a subtle foreshadowing of the horrors that are to come. That first night in the room was restless. The bed was hard, the air stifling despite the cold. As I lay awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, I began to hear something faint, barely audible at first, but unmistakably the sound of music. A violin. The melody was haunting and strange, and it seemed to rise and fall with an unnatural rhythm. It was beautiful, but at the same time, it carried a sense of deep sorrow and fear. I listened intently, trying to place its origin. It seemed to come from the floor above me, growing louder as the hours passed. Here we are introduced to the central element of the story, Erich Zann's music. The violin's eerie melody is described as both beautiful and unsettling, reflecting the dual nature of Zann's character and his connection to supernatural forces. The music represents something beyond normal human understanding, embodying Lovecraft's theme of forbidden knowledge. The fact that it grows louder as time passes suggests that whatever forces Zann is holding at bay are becoming more insistent, adding to the tension. The following day, my curiosity about the strange music grew too strong to resist. I asked the landlady about it, and she gave me a wary glance. "That would be Erich Zann," she said, her voice low. "He lives in the attic above you. Plays his violin most nights, though I wouldn't ask him about it if I were you." Despite her warning, I felt compelled to meet him. That evening, after hearing the first few notes of his nightly performance, I climbed the creaky staircase to the attic. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I found myself in a room as strange and disordered as the music itself. It was cluttered with old, mismatched furniture, and the only source of light came from a single candle flickering on a table. At the center of the room sat Erich Zann, a hunched figure with wild, unkempt hair. His back was to me, his body swaying slightly, as he played his violin with a feverish intensity. I stood there in silence, unsure whether to interrupt. This scene builds on the sense of mystery surrounding Zann. The landlady's caution suggests that Zann's music is not just a personal quirk, but something darker, perhaps dangerous. The description of Zann's attic room, cluttered, dimly lit, and chaotic, reflects the nature of his music, which is both mesmerizing and unsettling. Zann's intense playing hints that he is fully consumed by his music, reinforcing the idea that it serves a purpose beyond mere artistry, something tied to the forces of the unknown. As I entered the room, Zann's playing ceased abruptly. He turned to face me, and I was immediately struck by his appearance. His eyes were wide, filled with a strange mixture of fear and exhaustion, as though he had not slept in days. He stared at me for a long moment, his hands gripping the violin tightly. Before motioning for me to sit, I introduced myself, and to my surprise, Zann nodded in acknowledgement. He did not speak. The landlady had mentioned he was mute, but his eyes communicated something deeper, something unspoken. I gestured to the violin, complimenting his playing. Though my words felt inadequate to describe the strange beauty of the music, Zann's expression darkened at my mention of the music. He shook his head vigorously, and though he could not speak, his agitation was clear. He seemed almost afraid of the violin, as though it were not an instrument, but something far more dangerous. He scribbled something on a piece of paper and handed it to me. "Please, do not speak of my music again." This scene gives us our first direct interaction with Zann, revealing much about his character without the need for dialogue. His physical appearance, tired, anxious, and afraid, suggests that he is locked in a constant struggle with forces we do not yet understand. The fact that he reacts negatively to any mention of his music emphasizes its importance in the story. Zann's music is not merely an artistic expression, but something that has a much more ominous purpose. His silence, both literal and symbolic, reflects the broader theme in Lovecraft's work, that there are some truths too terrifying to speak of. My gaze wandered around the room, and I noticed something peculiar. In the far corner, there was a large, heavily curtained window. The drapes were thick and drawn tightly closed, despite the stifling atmosphere in the room. It was odd, as the rest of the apartment was cluttered and disordered, but the curtains seemed meticulously arranged, as though their purpose was to keep something out, or perhaps to keep something. And I asked Zann if the window offered a view of the city below, but he immediately tensed. His reaction was almost violent. He shook his head furiously, gripping the arms of his chair with knuckles white as bone. His eyes darted nervously toward the window, and I could see beads of sweat forming on his brow. Realizing I had touched on something forbidden, I quickly changed the subject. Zann, still shaken, returned to his violin, but the mood in the room had shifted. The music, once strange but captivating, now carried an unmistakable undercurrent of fear and desperation. The window is a key element in the story, symbolizing the barrier between the known world and whatever dark forces exist beyond. Zann's violent reaction to the mention of the window suggests that it is more than just an architectural feature. It is a threshold to something incomprehensible. This reinforces the idea that Zann's music is not simply art, but a tool to contain or combat whatever lies beyond the window. The window's ominous presence casts a shadow over the scene, heightening the tension and deepening the mystery of what Zann is truly facing. That night, back in my own room, I could not sleep. My mind was racing, filled with thoughts of the window, Zann's frantic behavior, and of course the music. As I lay there in the darkness, I began to hear it again, Zann's violin. But tonight, it was different. The music was no longer strange, but beautiful. It was chaotic, dissonant, and wild. It rose and fell in an almost unnatural pattern, as though Zann was playing not for pleasure, but out of necessity. The music grew louder, more frantic. It seemed to be building towards something, a crescendo of sound that filled the entire building. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, and then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, waiting for the music to resume, but it didn't. Instead, there was a new sound, a low, hollow wind. It seemed to be coming from above, from Zann's room, or perhaps from beyond the window in his room. This scene marks a turning point in the story. Zann's music, which had been unsettling but captivating, is now frantic and chaotic, signaling that something is coming. The music is no longer just strange, it is a desperate attempt to hold back an approaching horror. The fact that it abruptly stops, followed by the sound of the wind, hints that whatever Zann had been trying to keep at bay is now breaking through. This is a classic Lovecraftian moment, where the boundary between the natural world and the cosmic unknown begins to blur, filling the reader with a sense of impending doom. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me after the music had stopped so abruptly the previous night. I decided to visit Zann once more, hoping to understand the strange events I had experienced. As I made my way up the crooked stairs, I could already sense something was different. The air was thick with tension, and the usual quiet of the building seemed almost oppressive. I knocked on Zann's door, and after a long pause, it creaked open. Zann stood there, his face pale, his eyes wild with a kind of terror I had never seen in a human being. He beckoned me inside quickly, as if afraid of what might happen if the door remained open for too long. Once inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Zann's violin lay on the floor beside him, broken strings hanging limply. His room, once cluttered with furniture, now looked as though it had been ravaged by some unseen force. The curtains over the window were drawn even tighter than before, and Zann glanced toward them constantly, as if expecting something to burst through at any moment. Without waiting for me to speak, he grabbed a piece of paper and began writing frantically. When he handed it to me, I read the words with growing horror. I can no longer stop it. The music no longer holds. This scene heightens the sense of impending doom. Zann's broken violin and the disarray of his room are physical manifestations of his mental and emotional state. He is no longer in control of the situation, and the forces he had been holding back are breaking through. His frantic note confirms the reader's worst fears. The music, once a protective barrier, is no longer effective. This reflects Lovecraft's theme of humanity's fragility in the face of cosmic forces beyond comprehension. The tension is now at its peak, as the reader knows something terrible is coming but not when or how. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind swept through the room. Despite the curtains being drawn tightly shut, Zann jumped to his feet, his eyes wide with panic. He rushed to the window, desperately trying to secure the heavy drapes. But before he could reach them, the curtains were torn apart by an invisible force, and the window blew open with a violent crash. I gasped as I saw what lay beyond the window. There was no view of the city, no rooftops or streets below. Instead, there was only a vast, endless black void, swirling with strange lights and shapes that defied description. It was as though the fabric of reality itself had been torn open, revealing something beyond the world I knew. Zann screamed silently, his voice trapped in his throat, and began playing his violin again, despite the broken strings. His hands moved with a speed and desperation I had never seen before, but the music was discordant, wrong. Whatever force lay beyond the window was no longer being kept at bay. I stood frozen in place, unable to move, as the wind howled and the void seemed to pulse, drawing closer with every passing second. This scene brings the story to its climactic moment, where the boundary between reality and the cosmic unknown is shattered. The opening of the window reveals the Lovecraftian horror of an endless void, symbolizing the narrator's and humanity's insignificance in the face of the vast, uncaring universe. Zann's frantic attempt to play his violin, even with broken strings, shows his desperation to reestablish control, though it's clear that the forces he had been holding back are far beyond his ability to contain. The howling wind and the pulsing void evoke a sense of terror and inevitability, as the narrator realizes he is witnessing something far beyond his understanding. As the wind howled through the open window, the room itself seemed to twist and warp. The walls creaked under the strain, bending unnaturally as if reality itself was being pulled into the dark void beyond. Zann played with frantic intensity, his fingers flying over the broken strings, producing strange, discordant sounds that echoed against the howling wind. It was clear that the music was no longer a performance, it was a desperate battle. I could see the toll this was taking on Zann. His face, pale and drawn, was contorted with fear. Sweat dripped from his brow as he played on, his eyes fixed on the open window and the terrifying abyss beyond. The notes he produced were no longer music, but a chaotic, dissonant scream, as though he were trying to use sound itself to fight back the encroaching darkness, but it was futile. The swirling void beyond the window pulsed with a malevolent energy, drawing closer with every moment. I could feel its presence, cold and otherworldly, pressing in on all sides. The walls groaned louder, and the room seemed to tilt, as though we were teetering on the edge of falling into the abyss. I knew Zann could not hold it back for long. This scene represents the climactic struggle between Zann and the forces beyond the window. His violin playing has transformed from an art form into a weapon, a last-ditch effort to keep the cosmic void at bay. The warping of the room itself signifies that the boundaries between reality and the unknown are breaking down, emphasizing the theme of the fragility of human existence in the face of incomprehensible forces. Zann's desperate fight symbolizes humanity's struggle against the vast, indifferent cosmos, a battle that, as Lovecraft often suggests, is doomed from the start. In a single, horrifying instant, the violin fell silent. Zann's bow slipped from his trembling hands, clattering to the floor. He stood motionless, his face pale and stricken, staring helplessly at the open window. The void beyond seemed to swell, its swirling shapes and lights growing more intense, as though it sensed victory without the music to hold it back. The force beyond the window began to surge forward. The very air in the room became thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. I felt as if I were being pulled toward the window, drawn by an invisible current into the yawning abyss. Zann collapsed to the floor, clutching his violin to his chest, his eyes wide with terror. I could see that he was utterly defeated, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had fought with everything he had, but the darkness was too strong. His music, once so powerful, was no longer enough. At that moment, I realized that I had to escape. Whatever force had been held at bay by Zann's music was now free, and I had no desire to face it. I rushed to the door, pulled it open with trembling hands, and fled down the stairs, leaving Zann behind as I descended. I could still hear the faint sound of the wind howling through the building, growing louder and more ominous with every step. This scene marks the moment of Zann's ultimate failure. His collapse signifies that he can no longer contain the cosmic forces beyond the window, and the narrator's realization that escape is the only option heightens the sense of impending doom. The swell of the void and the oppressive atmosphere reflect Lovecraft's theme of overwhelming cosmic horror, where human effort is ultimately futile in the face of forces beyond comprehension. Zann's silence underscores the finality of the situation. Without the music, there is no defense left. The narrator's desperate flight adds to the tension, suggesting that whatever is coming is unstoppable. As I fled down the stairs, my mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. I could still hear the faint, ghostly echo of the howling wind from Zann's room above, as if it were following me. The air in the stairwell felt thick and oppressive, and the walls seemed to close in on me, as if the very building itself were warping under the weight of the dark forces I had glimpsed through the window. I reached the ground floor and stumbled out into the street, gasping for air. The cool night breeze hit my face, but it did little to calm the terror coursing through me. I looked back up at the tall, looming building, expecting to see anything at the attic window where Zann had fought so desperately, but the window was dark, and there was no sign of movement. I knew I should leave and get as far away from the building as possible, but I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that what I had witnessed would never leave me. The music, the void, Zann's desperate fight, it was all burned into my mind, an indelible mark of the horrors that existed beyond the thin veil of reality. And then, the last notes of Zann's violin echoed in my ears, once more, a sound not of beauty, but of madness. This scene captures the aftermath of the narrator's escape, emphasizing the psychological toll the events have taken on him. The description of the building warping in, the oppressive atmosphere, suggests that the dark forces are not confined to Zann's room but have affected the very fabric of the environment. The narrator's inability to fully detach himself from the events, despite physically fleeing, speaks to the lingering effects of cosmic horror. Once exposed to the truth of the universe, it is impossible to return to normalcy. The faint echo of Zann's violin represents the haunting nature of the experience and the narrator's descent into madness, a common theme in Lovecraft's work. In the days that followed, I found myself unable to think of anything else. Zann's music, the open window, the void beyond it consumed my thoughts, even in the quiet hours of the night. I tried to make sense of it, tried to rationalize what I had seen, but no explanation seemed sufficient. The more I pondered, the more it felt as though I had touched something vast and incomprehensible, something far beyond human understanding. I sought out the landlady, desperate for answers. But when I asked about Erich Zann, she seemed confused. She insisted there was no one by that name living in the building, and no one had ever rented the attic room. I returned to the building, only to find the room locked and empty. As though Zann had never existed at all, it was as if he and the dark forces that had surrounded him had been erased from reality itself. And yet, I knew what I had seen. I knew the music I had heard. The memory of that final, desperate melody haunted me, and I could feel the abyss lurking just beyond the edge of perception, always there, waiting. I had escaped Zann's fate, but I would never escape the knowledge of what lay beyond. The final scene brings closure to the story while reinforcing Lovecraft's signature themes. The narrator's inability to find any trace of Zann, combined with the landlady's denial of his existence, suggests that the events he witnessed were part of a larger, unknowable cosmic reality that operates beyond the normal constraints of time and space. This emphasizes the theme of existential horror. Human beings are insignificant in the grand, uncaring cosmos. The void, always lurking just beyond perception, symbolizes the ever-present threat of the unknown and the futility of trying to comprehend it. The narrator's fate is sealed, not by the void itself, but by the knowledge of its existence, leaving him in a state of perpetual dread and madness. And so, the haunting tale of Erich Zann comes to a close. In the end, we learn that Zann's music was not a mere performance, it was a desperate battle against forces beyond our understanding. The window to his room wasn't just a view, it was a portal to a terrifying void, a realm where human reason and perception mean nothing. Zann's frantic playing was the only thing holding back the darkness. And when the music stopped, the barrier between our world and the unknown collapsed. The story is not just about fear of the unknown, but about the fragility of human understanding in the face of an uncaring cosmos. It's a reminder that there are forces in the universe far beyond our control, forces that may always remain a mystery, no matter how hard we try to comprehend them. Lovecraft warns us that the pursuit of knowledge, especially of the dark and cosmic variety, may lead to madness or worse. The lesson we take from this tale is both sobering and chilling. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and sometimes ignorance truly is bliss. Erich Zann's fate serves as a stark reminder that not all knowledge is meant to be uncovered, and not every force in the universe can be defeated by human will. Thank you for joining us at TKX Stories. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of mystery, madness, and the unknown. Until next time, stay curious, but tread carefully when you peer into the darkness.